They thought Maya Chen was just another silent victim, a timid girl from the big city who would never dare to retaliate. But when Brittany Walsh and her crew decided to crush Maya's fingers in a locker door to teach her a lesson about staying in her lane, they had no idea they were about to face someone whose feet could shatter boards and whose precision could turn bone into powder. This is the story of how one act of savage cruelty awakened a sleeping dragon, and how 3 bullies learned that sometimes the most devastating storms come from the calmest skies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Chen pressed her shoulder against the heavy wooden door of Westfield High School, feeling the familiar weight of her worn messenger bag as she stepped into the fluorescent-lit hallway that had become her daily battlefield. The Oregon rain drummed steadily against the tall windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the chaos of teenagers rushing between classes, their voices echoing off the polished linoleum floors and industrial painted walls. For Maya, these hallways represented everything she had lost when her family moved from Portland 6 months ago, trading the anonymity of a large urban school for the suffocating intimacy of a small town where everyone knew your business before you even introduced yourself. At 17, Maya possessed the kind of understated presence that made her invisible in crowds, which had become both her survival strategy and her greatest source of loneliness. Standing 5 feet 4 inches with straight black hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail, she dressed in layers of muted colors that helped her blend into the background of rural Oregon life. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that teachers occasionally noticed during class discussions, but she had learned to keep her contributions brief and unremarkable, understanding that standing out in Millbrook meant becoming a target for those who ruled through intimidation and social exile. The move to Millbrook had been necessity rather than choice, driven by her mother Linda's desperate need to find stable employment after the divorce proceedings had drained their savings and left them struggling to maintain their Portland apartment. Linda Chen had accepted a position teaching 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary, a job that offered health insurance and the promise of a fresh start in a community where housing costs wouldn't consume every paycheck. For Maya, however, the transition had meant leaving behind not just friends and familiar surroundings, but an entire identity that she had spent years carefully constructing. Maya's mother worked with the dedication of someone who understood that their financial security depended on her success in this new position. Linda taught during the day and tutored struggling students in the evenings, often coming home with stacks of papers to grade and lesson plans to prepare for the following day. The extra income from tutoring helped cover the expenses that a teacher's salary couldn't quite stretch to meet, but it also meant that Maya spent most of her afternoons and evenings alone in their small rental house on the outskirts of town, far from the established neighborhoods where most of her classmates lived. The isolation had been Maya's shield during her first months at Westfield High School, allowing her to observe the complex social hierarchies that governed teenage life in a community where family names carried weight and athletic achievement determined social status. She had identified the key players within her first week, noting how power flowed through the hallways like an invisible current that could lift some students to popularity while crushing others beneath the weight of collective indifference or active hostility. Maya's academic performance had remained consistently strong despite the emotional challenges of adjustment, partly because she had always used intellectual achievement as a form of armor against the unpredictability of social interaction. Her grades in advanced mathematics and science courses caught the attention of teachers who were accustomed to working with students whose academic ambitions rarely extended beyond the boundaries of Millbrook itself. Several instructors had begun suggesting that Maya consider applying to universities that could offer her opportunities far beyond what their small town could provide. Conversations that filled her with both hope and anxiety about a future that seemed simultaneously promising and uncertain. The weather in Oregon had taken some adjustment for Maya, who had grown accustomed to the urban rhythms of Portland, but was now learning to navigate the muddy parking lots and rain-soaked walkways that characterized rural life during the autumn months. The constant precipitation created a sense of enclosed intimacy at Westfield High School, forcing students to spend more time in common areas and creating opportunities for both friendship and conflict that might have been avoided in better weather. Maya's daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance and strategic positioning, designed to minimize her exposure to the students who had identified her as an outsider worth tormenting. She arrived early enough to avoid the morning rush, ate lunch in the library rather than the cafeteria, and planned her routes between classes to stay clear of the areas where Brittany Walsh and her followers typically congregated. This approach had worked reasonably well for several months, allowing Maya to maintain her academic focus while staying below the radar of those who seemed to view newcomers as entertainment. The physical environment of Westfield High School reflected the community's practical approach to education, with sturdy construction and functional design taking precedence over aesthetic considerations. The hallways were wide enough to accommodate the flow of students between classes, lined with metal lockers that had been painted and repainted multiple times over the decades. The building's age showed in small details like the slightly uneven floors and the way certain doors stuck during humid weather, giving the school a lived-in character that spoke to generations of students who had walked these same paths toward graduation and whatever futures awaited them beyond Millbrook. Maya's locker was located in the main hallway, positioned strategically near the entrance to her most challenging class, but also unfortunately close to the territory that Brittany Walsh's group had claimed as their informal headquarters. The proximity had forced Maya to develop precise timing for her locker visits, calculating the moments when she could retrieve her books and materials without attracting unwanted attention from students who seemed to view her presence as an intrusion on their established domain. The messenger bag that Maya carried everywhere contained not just her textbooks and school supplies, but also the remnants of her previous life in Portland, including photographs and letters that connected her to friends who felt increasingly distant as the months passed. She had maintained some contact through social media and occasional phone calls, but the differences in their daily experiences had created a growing gap that made their conversations feel forced and superficial. As Maya navigated the crowded hallway toward her Spanish class, she remained unaware that her careful strategy of invisibility was about to be shattered by students who had grown bored with their usual targets and decided that the quiet girl from Portland needed to learn some harsh lessons about her place in the Westfield High School hierarchy. Brittany Walsh commanded Westfield High School with the effortless authority of someone born into local royalty, her family's name appearing on business signs throughout Millbrook, and her photograph gracing the trophy cases that lined the main office. At 18, she possessed the kind of natural magnetism that drew others into her orbit, combining genuine intelligence with a calculating understanding of how power worked in small communities where reputation could be inherited like family property. Her platinum blonde hair was always styled to perfection, and her wardrobe consisted of carefully curated pieces that managed to look both effortlessly casual and expensive enough to signal her family's financial position without appearing ostentatious. The Walsh family had been fixtures in Millbrook for 3 generations, starting with Brittany's grandfather, who had established the lumber processing facility that provided employment for nearly a quarter of the town's residents. Her father now owned the largest construction company in the county, along with interests in 2 restaurants and the town's only hotel, making the Walsh name synonymous with economic stability and community influence. This background had given Brittany a sense of entitlement that she wore like an invisible crown, expecting deference from those around her while maintaining the charming exterior that made her popular with adults who saw her as an exemplary young woman destined for great things. Brittany's boyfriend Derek Stone represented the athletic aristocracy that complemented her family's business prominence, his imposing 6'2" frame and natural leadership abilities making him the undisputed star of Westfield's football team. Derek had grown up on one of the area's larger farms, developing the kind of physical strength and competitive drive that translated seamlessly from agricultural work to athletic achievement. His broad shoulders and confident stride announced his presence wherever he went, and his easy smile masked a mean streak that emerged whenever he felt his authority was being challenged or questioned. Derek's relationship with Brittany was as much about social positioning as genuine affection, with both of them understanding that their pairing represented the natural order of things in Millbrook's teenage hierarchy. They had been together since sophomore year, their relationship weathering the typical ups and downs of high school romance while maintaining its status as the gold standard for what successful teenagers should aspire to achieve. Derek's football scholarship prospects and Brittany's academic achievements created a power couple dynamic that other students either admired or resented, depending on their own position within the school's social ecosystem. The third member of their inner circle was Ashley Kim, whose family had moved to Millbrook 5 years earlier when her father accepted a position as the town's pediatrician. Ashley's relative newcomer status had initially made her an outsider, but her desperate desire for acceptance had led her to attach herself to Brittany with the fervor of someone who understood that social survival required powerful allies. She had transformed herself into Brittany's most loyal follower, abandoning her own interests and personality traits in favor of becoming whatever version of herself would best serve the group's needs. Ashley carried professional-grade camera equipment everywhere, documenting every moment of their social lives with the obsessive dedication of someone building a multimedia shrine to popularity. Her Instagram account served as the unofficial record of Westfield High School's elite social circle, featuring carefully staged photographs that portrayed their lives as an endless series of enviable experiences and exclusive gatherings. The constant documentation served multiple purposes, both celebrating their status and creating evidence of their influence that could be used to intimidate or exclude others who might threaten their position. The dynamic between the three friends reflected a carefully maintained balance of power, with Brittany serving as the undisputed leader while Derek provided muscle and Ashley handled the technical aspects of their social media presence. They operated like a small corporation, with each member contributing specific skills toward the maintenance of their collective dominance over Westfield's teenage social landscape. Their success had been built on preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Foundation of strategic alliance building, careful image management, and the occasional demonstration of what happened to students who failed to respect their authority. Brittany's intelligence manifested itself in her ability to identify potential threats to her position long before they became serious challenges, allowing her to neutralize rivals through subtle manipulation rather than obvious confrontation. She understood that maintaining power required constant vigilance and periodic demonstrations of strength, lessons she had absorbed from watching her father navigate the business and political networks that kept their family at the center of Millbrook's decision-making processes. Her academic record was genuinely impressive, with advanced placement courses and leadership positions that would look excellent on college applications. But she also understood that academic achievement alone wasn't enough to guarantee the kind of future she envisioned for herself. Derek's role as enforcer was essential to their group's effectiveness, providing the physical presence necessary to back up Brittany's more subtle forms of pressure. His reputation as someone who could handle himself in any confrontation had been established during his freshman year, when he had decisively ended a challenge from an older student who had made the mistake of disrespecting Brittany in public. The incident had become part of Westfield's oral history, serving as a warning to anyone who might consider testing the boundaries of what Derek would tolerate when it came to protecting his girlfriend's reputation. Ashley's technical skills and social media expertise had become increasingly valuable as teenage life moved more and more into digital spaces where reputation could be built or destroyed with a single viral post. She understood the algorithms that determined which content would be seen by the largest audiences, and she had developed sophisticated strategies for amplifying positive coverage of their group while suppressing or discrediting material that portrayed them in unflattering ways. Her camera was always ready to capture moments that could be used either to celebrate their successes or to document the humiliation of their enemies. The three of them had spent their high school careers perfecting a system of social control that combined public charm with private ruthlessness, allowing them to maintain their popularity with teachers and administrators while systematically destroying students who posed threats to their dominance. Their methods were sophisticated enough to avoid detection by adults, who saw them as model students rather than the calculating predators they became when operating without supervision. Previous targets of their attention had either transferred to other schools, suffered academic and social consequences that followed them long after graduation, or simply endured years of misery while waiting for high school to end. The pattern was consistent and effective, with each successful campaign serving to reinforce their reputation and discourage potential challengers from even attempting to resist their influence. Chen's arrival at Westfield had initially registered as barely worth their attention, just another outsider who would either learn to stay in her lane or be taught the consequences of overreaching. Her quiet demeanor and obvious efforts to avoid drawing attention had seemed to confirm that she understood her place in the school's hierarchy and would pose no threat to their established order. For several months, this assessment had proven accurate, with Maya successfully maintaining the kind of low profile that allowed her to complete her education without interfering with their operations. However, recent developments had begun to shift their perception of Maya from harmless outsider to potential problem requiring more direct intervention. Her consistent academic performance and the positive attention she was receiving from certain teachers had started to create the kind of visibility that could eventually translate into social influence, particularly if she decided to become more assertive about claiming space within the school's competitive environment. The decision to escalate their response to Maya's presence had been made during one of their regular strategy sessions, held in Brittany's BMW in the student parking lot, where they could speak freely without fear of being overheard by students who might use their conversations against them. The discussion had focused on the need to establish clear boundaries before Maya's quiet confidence grew into something more threatening to their carefully maintained control over Westfield's social dynamics. The harassment campaign against Maya Chen began with the kind of methodical precision that Brittany Walsh applied to all her strategic endeavors, starting small and building gradually toward more serious forms of intimidation. The initial phase consisted of what appeared to be random acts of teenage carelessness that could easily be dismissed as coincidental if anyone bothered to investigate, but which followed a deliberate pattern designed to create mounting psychological pressure while maintaining plausible deniability for the perpetrators. Maya first noticed something was wrong when she arrived at her locker on a rainy Tuesday morning in late October to find that someone had stuffed wet paper towels through the ventilation slots, soaking her chemistry textbook and ruining 3 days' worth of carefully written notes. The damage was extensive enough to be genuinely upsetting, but subtle enough that reporting it would have seemed like an overreaction, particularly since the custodial staff might have caused the problem while cleaning the hallways during the previous evening. Maya spent her lunch period in the library, painstakingly recopying her notes from memory and trying to dry out the textbook pages that hadn't been completely destroyed by the moisture. The following week brought a series of similar incidents that individually seemed like minor inconveniences, but collectively created a pattern of disruption that made Maya's daily routine increasingly stressful and unpredictable. Her bicycle tires were deflated twice in the same week, forcing her to walk the 3 miles home in the rain when her mother was unavailable to provide transportation. Someone had apparently spilled coffee near her locker, creating a sticky mess that transferred to her books and papers whenever she tried to access her materials between classes. Her backpack disappeared from the library table where she always sat during lunch, turning up an hour later in the lost, and found with her homework assignments missing and her pens scattered throughout the bottom of the bag. Ashley, Kim's role in documenting these incidents became clear to Maya when she noticed the same girl always seemed to be nearby with her phone whenever something unfortunate happened. Ashley would position herself strategically to capture Maya's reactions to discovering damaged property or missing assignments, creating a digital record of humiliation that could be shared among their social circle or posted online if they decided to escalate their campaign to a more public level. The documentation served multiple purposes, both preserving evidence of their success in rattling their target and providing entertainment for students who enjoyed watching outsiders struggle to adapt to Westfield's unforgiving social environment. Maya's attempts to avoid confrontation by altering her routines and staying away from areas where Brittany's group typically gathered proved ineffective, as they seemed to anticipate her movements and adjust their tactics accordingly. When she started arriving earlier to school to avoid crowded hallways, she would find her locker jammed with chewing gum or discover that someone had taped offensive notes to the inside of her textbooks. When she began eating lunch in empty classrooms instead of the library, she would return to find her belongings missing or her assignments torn and scattered across the floor. The psychological warfare extended into Maya's academic life, as she discovered that group projects had become exercises in isolation and frustration. Whenever teachers assigned collaborative work, Maya would find herself partnered with students who either refused to participate meaningfully or actively sabotaged the group's efforts, leaving her to complete entire assignments alone while receiving shared credit with classmates who had contributed nothing to the final product. The pattern was consistent enough to suggest coordination, but proving deliberate manipulation would have required documentation that Maya lacked, and accusations that would have seemed paranoid to adults who weren't witnessing the daily microaggressions that were systematically undermining her ability to succeed academically. Derek Stone's contributions to the harassment campaign were more physical and intimidating, though still calculated to avoid crossing lines that might trigger serious consequences from school administrators. He would position himself in hallways so that Maya had to squeeze past his imposing frame to reach her destination, creating uncomfortable moments of forced proximity that made her feel vulnerable and off balance. During passing periods, he would walk just close enough behind her that she could feel his presence, occasionally making comments to his friends that were clearly intended for her to overhear, but weren't direct enough to constitute actionable harassment. The comments Derek made were particularly effective because they exploited Maya's insecurities about being an outsider in a close-knit community where family connections and local knowledge carried significant social weight. He would make observations about city girls who thought they were better than everyone else, or wonder aloud whether people from Portland understood how things worked in real communities where people looked out for each other. The remarks were delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that allowed him to maintain his reputation as a good-natured athlete, while systematically chipping away at Maya's confidence and sense of belonging. Brittany's approach was more sophisticated and harder to document, relying on social manipulation and strategic positioning to isolate Maya from potential sources of support within the student body. She would spread carefully crafted rumors about Maya's family situation, suggesting that they had moved to Millbrook because of problems in Portland that required a fresh start. The rumors were never specific enough to be definitively false, but they created an atmosphere of suspicion and judgment that made other students reluctant to associate with someone who might bring unwanted drama into their own lives. The effectiveness of Brittany's manipulation became apparent when Maya attempted to join study groups or participate in extracurricular activities that might have provided opportunities to build friendships with classmates who shared her academic interests. Somehow, other participants would always receive schedule changes or location updates that Maya never heard about, leaving her arriving at empty rooms or showing up for meetings that had been moved without her knowledge. The pattern was consistent and deliberate, but proving intentional exclusion would have required access to communication channels that Maya wasn't part of, and accusations that would have seemed paranoid without concrete evidence. Maya's mother, Linda, remained largely unaware of the harassment campaign because Maya had learned to hide her struggles rather than burden her mother with problems that would only add stress to an already difficult adjustment period. Linda was working long hours to establish herself at Millbrook Elementary and prove her value to administrators who were evaluating her performance during her probationary first year. The evening tutoring sessions that provided necessary supplemental income also meant that Linda was often too exhausted for extended conversations about Maya's social difficulties, particularly when Maya presented them as minor adjustment challenges rather than systematic persecution. The isolation was particularly devastating for Maya because it came at a time when she was already struggling with the loss of her support network in Portland and the uncertainty of her family's financial situation. The friends she had left behind were developing new relationships and moving forward with their lives, making their occasional phone calls feel increasingly forced and superficial. Maya found herself spending most evenings alone in their rental house, completing homework assignments that had been made more difficult by the daily disruptions to her materials and schedule, while her mother graded papers and prepared lessons for the following day. The academic pressure intensified as Maya realized that her grades were beginning to suffer from the constant stress and distraction of dealing with harassment during school hours. Her chemistry grade dropped when she was forced to retake a quiz after her study notes were destroyed, and her English essay received a lower score because she had been unable to access library resources during the time she had planned to conduct research. The cumulative effect was subtle, but real, threatening the academic excellence that had always been Maya's source of pride, and her pathway to college opportunities that could provide escape from Millbrook's suffocating social dynamics. Maya's attempts to document the harassment proved frustrating, because most incidents involved actions that were individually minor and could be explained as accidents or coincidences by anyone who wasn't experiencing the full pattern of systematic targeting. Teachers who witnessed isolated incidents would offer sympathy and general advice about high school social dynamics, but they lacked the comprehensive view necessary to understand that Maya was being subjected to a coordinated campaign rather than typical teenage drama that would resolve itself with time and maturity. The psychological toll of the harassment began to manifest in physical symptoms as Maya developed headaches and stomach problems that seemed to coincide with school days but disappeared during weekends and holidays. Her sleep patterns became irregular as she found herself lying awake at night, replaying the day's humiliations and trying to anticipate what new challenges might await her the following morning. The constant state of hypervigilance was exhausting, leaving her feeling drained and anxious even during moments when she should have been able to relax and recover. Maya's attempts to find refuge in academic achievement became more difficult as the harassment campaign expanded to target her intellectual pursuits directly. Her science fair project was vandalized the night before judging, forcing her to withdraw from competition after months of careful research and preparation. Her presentation materials for history class disappeared from her locker, requiring her to recreate slides and handouts during her lunch period, while other students were eating and socializing. The pattern suggested that Brittany's group had developed sophisticated methods for monitoring Maya's academic schedule and identifying opportunities to sabotage her efforts at the moments when intervention would cause maximum damage. The social media component of the harassment campaign remained largely invisible to Maya because she wasn't part of the networks where her humiliation was being shared and celebrated. Ashley Kim had created private group chats and restricted social media accounts where she shared photographs and videos of Maya's reactions to various incidents, building an audience of students who enjoyed watching the quiet outsider struggle to maintain her composure under mounting pressure. The digital documentation served as both entertainment and evidence of their group's power to control the experiences of students who failed to respect their authority. Maya's isolation was compounded by the way Brittany's campaign had poisoned potential relationships with classmates who might otherwise have been friendly or supportive. Students who had initially seemed interested in getting to know the new girl from Portland gradually became distant and unresponsive as rumors about her family situation and personality spread through Westfield's gossip networks. The social distancing was subtle but comprehensive, leaving Maya surrounded by classmates who treated her with polite indifference rather than the outright hostility that might have prompted adult intervention. The harassment campaign's effectiveness lay in its ability to create the appearance of organic social rejection rather than deliberate persecution, making it nearly impossible for Maya to explain her situation to adults who might have been able to help. When teachers noticed her increasing isolation and declining participation in class discussions, they attributed it to typical adjustment difficulties for a transfer student rather than systematic bullying that required intervention. The plausible explanations for every incident made it easy for administrators to dismiss Maya's occasional complaints as personality conflicts or misunderstandings that would resolve themselves as she learned to fit into Westfield's social environment. Maya's growing desperation led her to consider options that she had previously rejected, including asking her mother to request a transfer to another district or homeschooling arrangements that would allow her to complete her education without enduring daily harassment. However, both alternatives would have required financial sacrifices that their family couldn't afford, and explanations about her social difficulties that Maya remained reluctant to provide. The knowledge that her mother was working so hard to build a new life in Millbrook made it difficult for Maya to admit that the transition was failing catastrophically from her perspective. The harassment campaign reached a new level of sophistication when Brittany began targeting Maya's relationship with teachers who had shown interest in her academic potential. Carefully timed disruptions would occur whenever Maya was meeting with instructors about advanced placement opportunities or college preparation resources, creating the impression that she was unreliable or unprepared for additional responsibilities. The sabotage was subtle enough to seem like poor time management rather than deliberate interference, but it effectively undermined the positive relationships that might have provided Maya with adult advocates who could have recognized and addressed the systematic nature of her difficulties. As November approached and the harassment campaign entered its third month, Maya found herself trapped in a situation that seemed to have no solution within the normal channels of conflict resolution that adults typically recommended. The daily accumulation of small humiliations and setbacks had created a level of chronic stress that was affecting every aspect of her life, from her academic performance to her physical health to her relationship with her mother. The careful documentation and strategic coordination of Brittany's group had created a form of persecution that was both devastating in its effects and nearly impossible to prove or prosecute through conventional means. The stage was being set for an escalation that would force Maya to confront the reality that her strategy of patient endurance and conflict avoidance was not going to be sufficient to survive her remaining time at Westfield High School. What nobody at Westfield High School understood about Maya Chen was that beneath her carefully maintained facade of quiet compliance lived someone who had been forged in the crucible of elite combat sports since the age of 7. Hidden behind her modest clothing and downcast eyes was a martial artist whose kicks could split wooden boards cleanly in half and whose timing had been honed through thousands of hours of disciplined training under masters who demanded nothing less than perfection from their students. Maya's journey into Taekwondo had begun not from any childhood fascination with martial arts movies or teenage rebellion, but from a traumatic experience that had fundamentally altered her understanding of personal safety and the brutal realities that could destroy innocent lives without warning. When Maya was 6 years old, living in Portland with both parents in what seemed like a stable and secure middle-class existence, she had witnessed something that would haunt her nightmares for years afterward and ultimately shape the trajectory of her entire adolescence. During a family outing to Powell's Books, Maya had become separated from her parents while exploring the children's section, wandering into a quiet corner of the store where she discovered a young woman being attacked by someone who had followed her from the parking lot. The violence was swift and brutal, unfolding in the space of minutes while Maya hid behind a bookshelf, too terrified to move or call for help, as she watched another human being's dignity and sense of safety being systematically destroyed. The aftermath of witnessing that assault had left Maya with recurring nightmares and a crippling fear of public spaces that interfered with every aspect of her daily life. She became reluctant to leave the house without her parents, developed panic attacks when forced to navigate crowded areas, and struggled with a constant sense of vulnerability that made normal childhood activities feel impossibly dangerous. Her parents tried various forms of therapy and counseling, but nothing seemed to address the fundamental helplessness that Maya felt whenever she remembered how completely powerless she had been to help someone who desperately needed assistance. Maya's father, Chen, had served 2 tours with the Army Rangers before transitioning to civilian life and pursuing a career in construction management. His military background had given him a realistic understanding of the violence that existed in the world, and the importance of being prepared to defend oneself and others when circumstances demanded action rather than words. After watching his daughter struggle with trauma-induced anxiety for nearly a year, Michael made a decision that would transform Maya's life in ways that neither of them could have anticipated at the time. The dojang that Michael selected for Maya's introduction to martial arts was located in southeast Portland, operated by Master Kim Sung-ho, a 7th-degree black belt who had immigrated from South Korea in the 1980s, and established one of the most respected Taekwondo programs on the West Coast. Master Kim's approach to teaching combined traditional Korean discipline with modern sports science, creating an environment where students learned not just physical techniques, but mental resilience and philosophical principles that emphasized responsibility, respect, and the proper use of power when confronted with situations that required decisive action. Maya's first months at the dojang were marked by struggles that had little to do with learning kicks and punches, and everything to do with overcoming the psychological barriers that trauma had erected around her sense of personal agency. Master Kim recognized immediately that this quiet 7-year-old girl was carrying emotional wounds that went far deeper than typical childhood shyness, and he adapted his teaching methods accordingly, focusing initially on building Maya's confidence through small achievements rather than pushing her toward competitive goals that might have overwhelmed her fragile sense of self-worth. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, as Maya began to develop physical skills that translated into mental strength and emotional resilience. Master Kim's teaching philosophy emphasized that Taekwondo was not primarily about fighting, but about developing the discipline and inner peace that made fighting unnecessary in most situations. However, he also made it clear that students who reached advanced levels would be expected to use their abilities to protect innocent people who could not protect themselves, carrying forward the warrior tradition that had shaped Korean martial arts for centuries. Maya's dedication to training quickly became legendary within the dojang community as she threw herself into practice with an intensity that amazed instructors who were accustomed to working with students whose commitment fluctuated based on mood and convenience. She attended every available class, arrived early to practice basic techniques, and stayed late to work on advanced forms that wouldn't normally be taught to students at her level. The physical demands of Taekwondo training provided an outlet for the nervous energy and hypervigilance that had characterized Maya's behavior since the assault she had witnessed, channeling her anxiety into productive activity that built strength, rather than feeding destructive patterns of avoidance and fear. Master Kim's curriculum emphasized the scientific principles behind Taekwondo techniques, teaching students to understand the biomechanics of kicks and strikes, rather than simply memorizing choreographed movements. Maya excelled at this analytical approach, learning to calculate angles and leverage points with mathematical precision, while developing the muscle memory necessary to execute techniques under pressure. Her academic intelligence translated seamlessly into martial arts application, allowing her to master complex combinations and timing sequences that challenged students who had been training for much longer periods. By the time Maya reached her 9th birthday, she had earned her red belt and was beginning to train with teenagers who possessed significant size and strength advantages. Master Kim had identified her as a student with exceptional potential, not just because of her technical proficiency, but because of her ability to remain calm under pressure and think strategically, even during intense sparring sessions. Her small stature had initially seemed like a disadvantage, but Master Kim taught her to use speed and precision to overcome opponents who relied on strength and aggression, turning size differences into tactical advantages through superior technique and timing. Maya's first tournament experience came when she was 10 years old, competing in a regional championship that drew young martial artists from across the Pacific Northwest. The competition format included both forms divisions, where students demonstrated choreographed sequences of techniques, and sparring divisions that tested their ability to apply those techniques against resisting opponents. Maya had been nervous about competing against students from other schools, but Master Kim had prepared her thoroughly, emphasizing that tournaments were opportunities to test training rather than life-or-death competitions that defined personal worth. The forms competition showcased Maya's technical precision and attention to detail as she performed complex sequences with a fluidity and power that impressed judges who had not expected such sophisticated technique from someone so young. Her movements were sharp and controlled, demonstrating the kind of focus and discipline that typically required years of dedicated training to develop. When the scores were announced, Maya had placed second in her division, losing only to a competitor who was 2 years older and had been training since early childhood. The sparring competition proved to be Maya's true strength, as she faced opponents who underestimated her based on her size and quiet demeanor, only to discover that her kicks possessed surprising power and her defensive techniques were virtually flawless. Maya's strategy involved maintaining distance and using her superior flexibility to execute high kicks that her opponents couldn't match, while her footwork kept her constantly moving and difficult to target effectively. The combination of technical skill and tactical intelligence allowed her to defeat several competitors who had been expected to dominate their divisions. Maya's victory in the sparring division marked the beginning of a competitive career that would eventually take her to national championships and attract attention from college recruiters who recognized her potential for athletic scholarships. However, the most important outcome of that first tournament was the confidence it gave Maya in her ability to handle challenging situations without being overwhelmed by fear or anxiety. The panic attacks that had plagued her for years began to diminish as she developed faith in her capacity to protect herself and respond effectively to threatening circumstances. Master Kim's training philosophy evolved as Maya progressed through the intermediate ranks, introducing concepts about mental discipline and emotional control that went far beyond basic self-defense techniques. He taught her meditation practices that enhanced focus and concentration, breathing exercises that could calm nervousness before competitions, and visualization techniques that allowed her to rehearse responses to various scenarios before encountering them in reality. The mental training became as important as the physical conditioning, creating a foundation of inner strength that would serve Maya throughout her teenage years. The Dojang community became Maya's second family, as she formed friendships with other serious students who shared her commitment to excellence and personal growth. These relationships were built on mutual respect and common goals rather than the superficial connections that characterized many childhood friendships, creating bonds that would last throughout her adolescence, even as her family's circumstances changed. The older students served as mentors and role models, demonstrating that martial arts training could produce individuals who were both formidable competitors and genuinely compassionate human beings. Maya's progression through the colored belt ranks was steady and well-earned, with each promotion representing months of dedicated training and demonstrated mastery of increasingly complex techniques. Master Kim's standards were exacting, requiring students to show not just technical proficiency but also character development and understanding of the philosophical principles that distinguish traditional martial arts from mere fighting systems. Maya embraced these requirements enthusiastically, recognizing that the mental and ethical components of her training were just as valuable as the physical skills she was developing. The breaking techniques that became Maya's specialty required precise timing and perfect form to execute safely and effectively. Master Kim taught her to focus her energy into small contact points, generating tremendous force through proper body mechanics rather than relying on brute strength. Maya's breaking demonstrations became crowd favorites at tournaments and promotional events, as spectators watched in amazement while a seemingly delicate teenage girl shattered boards and concrete blocks with kicks and strikes that defied expectations based on her appearance. Maya's training intensified significantly when she reached the advanced ranks, with Master Kim introducing her to applications and scenarios that prepared serious students for real-world self-defense situations. These training sessions went beyond tournament sparring to include techniques for dealing with larger attackers, multiple opponents, and enclosed spaces where mobility might be limited. The scenarios were designed to test not just physical techniques but decision-making under pressure, and the ability to escalate or de-escalate confrontations based on circumstances and available options. The philosophical education that accompanied Maya's physical training emphasized the responsibility that came with developing dangerous capabilities, teaching her to understand violence as a last resort that should be used only when other options had been exhausted or were unavailable. Master Kim shared stories from Korean martial arts history about warriors who had used their skills to protect innocent people and preserve justice. But he also cautioned against the temptation to use superior abilities to dominate or intimidate others who posed no genuine threat. Maya's sparring partners during her final years in Portland included college students and adult competitors who challenged her in ways that prepared her for the highest levels of competition. Master Kim arranged special training sessions with visiting masters from other schools, exposing Maya to different fighting styles and techniques that expanded her tactical repertoire. These experiences taught her to adapt quickly to unfamiliar opponents and develop strategies on the fly, skills that would prove invaluable when she eventually faced challenges that had nothing to do with formal competition. The decision to move to Oregon had been devastating for Maya, not just because it meant leaving friends and familiar surroundings, but because it separated her from Master Kim and the Dojang community that had become the center of her identity. She had earned her first-degree black belt just 6 months before the move, an achievement that represented 8 years of dedicated training and personal growth. The timing felt cruel, forcing her to abandon the support system and training environment that had shaped her into a confident and capable young woman just as she was reaching her peak potential. Maya's attempts to find comparable training opportunities in Millbrook had proven futile, as the small town offered no martial arts schools that met her standards for serious instruction. The nearest Taekwondo dojang was located nearly an hour away in a larger city, making regular attendance impossible without reliable transportation and family resources that were already stretched thin by the relocation expenses. The isolation from formal training had been almost as difficult to bear as the social challenges she faced at Westfield High School, leaving her feeling disconnected from the activity that had defined her self-concept for most of her conscious memory. Maya had maintained her conditioning and practiced forms in private, using online videos and memories of Master Kim's instruction to preserve the technical skills she had worked so hard to develop. However, training alone lacked the intensity and feedback that came from working with qualified partners and instructors, gradually eroding the razor-sharp reflexes and timing that had made her such a formidable competitor. The physical deterioration was subtle but real, representing another loss in a year that had already taken away so many of the things that had made her feel strong and capable. The black belt that hung in Maya's bedroom closet, carefully preserved in its protective bag, served as a daily reminder of the person she had been before circumstances forced her to hide her true capabilities behind a mask of vulnerability and compliance. The contrast between her current situation and her former confidence was painful, but it also represented a reservoir of strength that could be accessed if circumstances ever demanded that she stop pretending to be helpless and reveal the warrior that Master Kim's training had created within her. The breaking point came on a cold December morning when freezing rain had turned Westfield High School's parking lot into a treacherous sheet of ice, forcing students to navigate carefully between vehicles while clutching their backpacks and trying not to slip on the slick pavement. Maya had arrived earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the crowded hallways and retrieve her Spanish textbook before first period began. The building felt different in the early morning quiet, with most classrooms still dark and the hallways echoing with the sounds of custodial staff finishing their cleaning routines before the daily chaos of teenage life descended upon the school. Maya's locker was located in the main hallway near the administrative offices, positioned in what should have been one of the safest areas of the building due to its proximity to teachers and staff members who arrived early for planning periods and meetings. The metal lockers at Westfield were older models with heavy doors and combination locks that required precise manipulation to open properly, especially during cold weather when the mechanisms tended to stick and resist the exact sequences of numbers that students had memorized through months of repetition. As Maya approached her locker, she noticed that someone had apparently spilled something sticky on the floor nearby, creating a small puddle that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead and suggested that the custodial staff had not yet completed their cleaning routine in this section of the building. She made a mental note to step carefully around the mess while opening her locker, not wanting to track whatever substance had been spilled into her first period classroom, where it might draw unwanted attention from her teacher or classmates. The combination to Maya's locker was a sequence of numbers that she had chosen carefully, using her birthday and the anniversary of earning her black belt to create something meaningful that would be easy to remember even under stress. She had practiced opening the lock countless times since arriving at Westfield, developing the muscle memory necessary to manipulate the dial quickly during the brief passing periods between classes when hundreds of students were trying to access their lockers simultaneously in a rush to gather materials and reach their next destinations on time. Maya was turning the dial to complete the final number in her combination when she heard footsteps approaching from behind, the sound of expensive athletic shoes moving across the polished linoleum with the confident stride that she had learned to associate with students who expected others to move out of their way. She didn't turn around immediately, focused on the delicate task of opening her stubborn lock while balancing her backpack and trying not to step in the puddle that someone had left near her feet. Brittany Walsh's voice cut through the morning quiet with false sweetness that barely masked the underlying menace in her tone, the kind of artificial friendliness that adults might mistake for genuine concern but which Maya had learned to recognize as a warning signal that danger was approaching rapidly. Well, 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 look who's here bright and early, trying to avoid the rest of us normal students who don't need to sneak around like criminals. Maya's shoulders tensed instinctively as she registered the presence of multiple people behind her, the subtle sounds of movement and breathing that indicated she was outnumbered and potentially trapped against her locker with limited options for escape or evasion. She completed her combination sequence and felt the lock click open, but she hesitated before pulling the door wide, uncertain whether opening the locker would provide access to her books or simply create a larger target for whatever harassment Brittany had planned for this encounter. Derek Stone moved to Maya's left side, positioning himself close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his large frame as he loomed over her with the kind of intimidating presence that had made him effective at controlling other students through implied threats of physical violence. His voice carried the casual menace of someone who had never faced serious consequences for bullying behavior, the confidence of an athlete who knew that teachers and administrators were reluctant to discipline star players during football season. "You know, Maya, we've been trying to be patient with you," Derek said, his words carrying the false reasonableness that bullies often use to justify escalating harassment while maintaining the pretense that their victims had somehow brought trouble upon themselves. "We've given you plenty of time to figure out how things work around here, plenty of opportunities to learn your place and start acting like you belong instead of walking around like you think you're better than everyone else." Ashley Kim had positioned herself directly behind Maya, close enough to record whatever was about to happen, while maintaining enough distance to avoid being identified as an active participant if the situation escalated beyond what could be dismissed as teenage drama. Her phone was already in her hand, camera app open, and ready to capture whatever humiliation Brittany had orchestrated for this early morning encounter, when witnesses would be minimal and adult supervision practically non-existent. Maya's mind began calculating distances and angles with the automatic precision that years of martial arts training had ingrained in her subconscious, assessing escape routes and potential defensive positions while maintaining the outward appearance of someone who was confused and intimidated, rather than tactically analyzing the situation. She had learned from Master Kim that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appeared harmless until the moment they struck, and she understood that revealing her capabilities prematurely might escalate the confrontation beyond what was necessary for her safety. Brittany stepped closer, invading Maya's personal space with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never encountered serious resistance to her bullying tactics. Her voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more threatening than shouting would have been, the kind of quiet menace that suggested she was fully committed to whatever course of action she had planned and would not be deterred by pleas for mercy or attempts at negotiation. "The problem is that you still don't seem to understand that this is our school, our territory, our rules." Brittany continued, her blue eyes cold with calculation as she studied Maya's face for signs of the fear and submission that had characterized her previous victims when they finally realized the hopelessness of their situations. Maybe you need a more direct lesson about respect and knowing your place in the social order that keeps this school running smoothly. Maya's hands remained steady as she gripped her locker door, but every muscle in her body was coiled with potential energy, ready to explode into motion if the situation crossed the line from intimidation into actual physical assault. She had promised her mother to avoid trouble and focus on her education, but she had also learned from Master Kim that sometimes avoiding conflict required demonstrating the willingness and ability to engage in it decisively when circumstances left no other options available. Derek reached out and placed his large hand on Maya's shoulder, applying pressure that was ostensibly friendly, but contained enough force to communicate his physical dominance and her vulnerability to more serious violence if she continued to resist their authority. The contact crossed a boundary that transformed the encounter from verbal harassment into physical intimidation, changing the legal and moral calculus of whatever response Maya might choose to employ in defending herself. "All you have to do is apologize for thinking you could come into our school and act like you own the place," Derek said, his grip tightening on Maya's shoulder in a way that would likely leave bruises as evidence of this encounter. "Admit that you're nobody special, just another transfer student who needs to learn some humility, and maybe we can work out an arrangement that lets you finish the school year without any more problems." Brittany nodded approvingly at Derek's suggestion, but Maya could see in her expression that no apology would be sufficient to end their campaign of harassment because the goal was not compliance but complete domination and ongoing entertainment at her expense. This confrontation was designed to be the beginning of a new phase of persecution rather than the conclusion of their conflict, and any submission now would only encourage more aggressive future attacks. "Of course, we'll need some kind of guarantee that you've really learned your lesson," Brittany added with a smile that contained no warmth or genuine humor. "Something that shows everyone at this school exactly where you stand in the pecking order, and what happens to outsiders who don't show proper respect to their betters." Ashley stepped closer with her phone, anticipating the moment when Maya would break down and provide the kind of dramatic footage that would cement her humiliation and serve as entertainment for their social media followers. The positioning suggested that they had choreographed this encounter carefully, planning each element to maximize both Maya's suffering and their ability to document and share her. Her words carrying none of the fear or submission that her tormentors expected to hear from someone who was outnumbered and apparently helpless against their coordinated attack. "I think you should let go of me now and walk away while you still can." Derek laughed at what he perceived as empty bravado from someone who lacked the physical capability to back up her words with meaningful resistance. His grip on Maya's shoulder tightened further as he prepared to demonstrate the futility of defiance against someone with his size and strength advantages, confident that any attempt at resistance would only make her eventual surrender more complete and satisfying. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in, sweetheart," Derek said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that he used when explaining obvious realities to people who seemed too stupid to grasp their own powerlessness. "This isn't Portland where you can just blend into the crowd and avoid consequences for your attitude. This is Millbrook, and in Millbrook, people learn to show respect or they learn it the hard way." Brittany moved to Maya's right side, creating a triangular formation that blocked most of her potential escape routes, while positioning all three attackers to contribute to whatever physical punishment they had planned for this encounter. The coordination was smooth and practiced, suggesting that they had used similar tactics against previous victims who had been isolated and overwhelmed by superior numbers and aggressive positioning. "Since you seem to need a more direct lesson in humility," Brittany said, her voice taking on the cold satisfaction of someone who was about to inflict serious harm and fully intended to enjoy the experience, "I think it's time we showed you exactly what happens to little girls who think they can challenge people who actually matter in this community." The moment when everything changed forever came when Derek shifted his grip from Maya's shoulder to her arm, attempting to pull her away from her locker and toward a more isolated location where they could continue their assault without fear of interruption from teachers or administrators who might object to their methods of conflict resolution. The pulling motion forced Maya to make a choice between allowing herself to be moved to a secondary location where the violence would certainly escalate, or revealing the capabilities that she had kept hidden for months while enduring their systematic harassment. Maya's response was to step backward and reach for her locker door, ostensibly to steady herself, but actually to position her body for what Master Kim had taught her was the most effective defensive technique when faced with multiple attackers in a confined space. Her movement seemed natural and unremarkable to observers who didn't understand the biomechanics of martial arts, but it placed her in the optimal stance for generating maximum power and speed when the moment came to strike. Brittany apparently interpreted Maya's backward movement as an attempt to escape or call for help, because she immediately moved forward to block access to the main hallway while nodding to Ashley to begin recording the confrontation. The gesture was meant to signal that they had moved beyond intimidation into active assault, crossing legal and moral boundaries that would have serious consequences if their victim proved capable of defending herself effectively. The trigger moment came when Derek attempted to grab Maya's other arm while Brittany reached for her backpack, apparently intending to throw it on the floor and scatter her belongings as a preliminary humiliation before moving to more serious forms of physical abuse. The coordination of their attack left no doubt about their intentions, and no possibility that this could be dismissed as harmless teenage drama or a misunderstanding between students who were still learning appropriate social boundaries. Maya's left hand shot forward with the precision of a striking snake, her fingers extended and aligned perfectly to target the pressure point just below Derek's sternum, where Master Kim had taught her that even moderate force could disrupt breathing and create temporary paralysis of the diaphragm. The strike was delivered with all the speed and power that 8 years of dedicated training had developed, transferring her body weight and rotational momentum into a focused impact that Derek's athletic conditioning had never prepared him to absorb or counter. Derek's grip on Maya's arm released immediately as his body went into shock from the unexpected strike to his solar plexus, his confidence and aggression transforming instantly into confusion and pain as he struggled to understand what had just happened to him. The technique was designed to be non-permanently damaging, but completely incapacitating in the short term, giving Maya the time and space necessary to address the remaining threats without having to worry about Derek recovering quickly enough to rejoin the attack. Brittany's expression shifted from anticipatory satisfaction to shocked disbelief as she watched her supposedly helpless victim demonstrate capabilities that contradicted everything she thought she knew about power dynamics and physical dominance. The quiet transfer student who was supposed to be crying and begging for mercy had just dropped the school's star athlete with a single precise strike, revealing hidden depths that suggested this confrontation was not going to unfold according to their carefully planned script. Maya's right leg came up in a perfect front kick that caught Brittany in the center of her chest, the impact calculated to knock her backward and disrupt her balance without causing permanent injury to someone who lacked the conditioning to absorb martial arts techniques safely. The kick demonstrated the kind of flexibility and power that required years of dedicated training to develop, proving that Maya's capabilities extended far beyond the defensive strike that had neutralized Derek's immediate threat. Ashley dropped her phone as the reality of the situation penetrated her shock, the device clattering across the linoleum floor as she realized that she was witnessing something far different from the systematic humiliation that she had been recruited to document for their social media entertainment. The quiet girl who had endured months of harassment without meaningful resistance had transformed into someone whose movements carried the precision and confidence of a trained fighter, someone who clearly possessed the skills necessary to defend herself against multiple attackers. Maya's voice carried absolute authority when she spoke again, her words cutting through the shocked silence that had fallen over the hallway as her attackers processed the complete reversal of power that had occurred in the space of seconds. "I told you to walk away while you still could. Now you're going to learn why my family really moved to Oregon, and why sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous one to underestimate." The final escalation came when Brittany, apparently driven by desperation and inability to accept the destruction of her carefully constructed image of dominance, lunged forward and attempted to slam Maya's fingers in the locker door with enough force to break bones and create permanent damage. The action crossed every possible line between harassment and serious assault, demonstrating malicious intent to cause lasting physical harm that would have legal consequences extending far beyond typical school disciplinary procedures. Maya's response was instantaneous and devastating, her right foot coming up in a perfect hook kick that caught Brittany in the side of her head with precisely the amount of force necessary to render her unconscious without causing permanent brain damage. The technique was executed with the kind of surgical precision that Master Kim had demanded from his advanced students, demonstrating perfect control and tactical awareness even under the stress of defending against multiple attackers in a confined space. The sound of Brittany's body hitting the floor echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot, the impact serving as punctuation to a confrontation that had revealed truths about power, capability, and the consequences of systematic cruelty that would reshape the social dynamics at Westfield High School forever. Maya stood over her unconscious tormentor, her breathing controlled and her stance ready for continued action, while Derek struggled to regain his breath and Ashley cowered against the opposite wall in terror. Maya's final words to the broken remnants of Westfield's former ruling triumvirate carried the weight of absolute authority and the promise of consequences that would extend far beyond this single moment of justice. The next time you think about hurting someone who can't defend themselves, remember this morning and ask yourself whether you're prepared to face someone who can. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.